Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, I want to start by asking you, and really everyone listening, to try and dismantle a, um, a very common assumption we all carry around.
It's a tough one to shake off.
Yeah, it really is. It's about what actually makes a nation a nation. Because usually when we try to check that box, we look for the obvious hardware, right?
Yeah.
You've got borders drawn on a map, you've got a flag flying at the Olympics, maybe a currency with a president's face on it.
The standard checklist of sovereignty.
Exactly. We see those things and we think, okay, that's a country, done deal. But if you look at the Horn of Africa, or really any region in the world with deep ethnic or tribal complexity, you realize pretty quickly that the hardware isn't enough.
No, it really isn't.
You could have the flag and the anthem and the seat at the UN, and the whole thing can still just fall apart overnight. So the question we're wrestling with today is there a piece of invisible infrastructure that actually keeps a country from disintegrating?
It's a fantastic question to kick this off. And the source material we are analyzing today suggests that the answer is a definitive yes.
Okay.
It argues that for diverse nations, unity isn't just a feeling or some happy accident. It's a legal construct. We're looking at a really fascinating analysis titled Kenya's National Cohesion and Integration Act, a blueprint for unity in the Horn of Africa.
And I want to be super clear to you listening right now, this isn't just a dry legal review of some obscure bill.
Not at all.
We are effectively looking at a user manual for how to stop a civil war before it starts.
Yeah.
We're going to look at Kenya's experiment with literally legislating unity and then see how that blueprint applies to its neighbors. So we're talking about Somaliland, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Sudan.
Right. And just to set the stakes here from the sources, the Horn of Africa is one of the most volatile regions on Earth. And that's specifically because of how identity politics works there.
Yeah.
The whole premise of this analysis is that you can't just wish for peace. You actually have to build a regulatory framework that makes peace the path of least resistance.
So let's start at ground zero. This Kenyan law, the National Cohesion and Integration Act, or the NCIA.
Right.
It didn't just appear out of thin air because politicians were feeling generous. It was a reaction to a very specific, very scary trauma.
It was an emergency brake.
Yeah.
We have to go back to late 2007 and early 2008. Kenya went through a horrific post-election crisis. The election results were disputed, and almost instantly, the country fractured along ethnic lines.
I remember the headlines from that time. It wasn't just political protests in the capital. It was localized, highly targeted violence.
Exactly. It was neighbors turning on neighbors based entirely on tribe. Over 1,000 people died. Hundreds of thousands were displaced.
Yeah.
And for a lot of observers, both inside and outside the country, that was a massive shock. Kenya was supposed to be the stable anchor of East Africa.
Right, the safari destination, the economic hub.
Exactly. It completely shattered the illusion. It showed that the quote-unquote nation was much more fragile than anyone thought. So when the dust finally settled, the government, along with international mediators, realized that a simple ceasefire just wasn't going to cut it.
They couldn't just say, okay, stop fighting, let's go back to normal.
Right, because normal was broken. They needed to address the root cause, which the sources point out was that ethnicity had been weaponized for political gain.
So they passed the NCIA in 2008. But look, laws are usually just words on paper unless they actually do something.
Yeah.
What was the actual mechanism here? Because I can write, be nice to each other on a piece of paper, but that doesn't change a society.
Yeah, the act didn't just offer suggestions. It created a specific body called the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, the NCIC. And their mandate was incredibly specific. It wasn't just some vague order to go promote unity. It was investigate and prosecute hate speech, prevent discrimination in how public resources are distributed, and crucially, ensure that public institutions actually reflect the diversity of the country.
That last part seems like the real heavy lifting. Reflect the diversity. I mean, that means you can't have the Ministry of Finance or the police force or the army dominated by one single tribe.
Exactly. Because in many post-colonial states, the government is often viewed as a vehicle for resource extraction for whoever happens to be in charge.
Right. If my guy is president, my village gets the paved road and the new water project.
And if your guy is president, I get nothing.
Yeah.
So the NCIC was tasked with auditing the government to ensure that the actual face of Kenya was represented on the state payroll.
There's a line in the source material that I highlighted because it feels like the thesis statement for this entire deep dive. It says, diversity is not a weakness. Unmanaged diversity is.
It's a brilliant reframing.
It really is.
We so often hear diversity described as a challenge to be overcome. But this analysis argues that diversity is an asset, sort of like high voltage electricity. It powers the country.
But if you don't have a grid to manage that
The
energy,
legal grid.
right, a legal grid, then it causes a blackout, or in this case, a civil war.
Exactly.
So that is the Kenya model, an attempt to build the grid.
Hmm.
Now, the analysis shifts gears and acts almost like a diagnostic mechanic. It looks at the neighbors in the Horn of Africa and asks, does this medicine work for these specific symptoms?
And the symptoms across the region are severe. The source discusses identity politics, but I want to be really clear about what that means in this context.
Yeah, please do.
We aren't talking about arguments on Twitter or cable news debates. In the Horn of Africa, identity politics determines survival. It dictates who gets water rights, who gets justice in a local court, and whether the police protect you or harass you.
It's an existential calculation for every single family.
It is. When state institutions are captured by one clan or one ethnic group, the state loses its legitimacy to everyone else. Because why would I obey a police officer if that officer is essentially just a militia member for a rival tribe wearing a state uniform?
You wouldn't. You just wouldn't.
Yeah.
So let's look at how this plays out, and let's start with Somaliland. Now, usually when we talk about Somaliland, it's held up as the success story of the region.
Right.
It declared independence, it has its own functioning government, it's relatively stable compared to southern Somalia. Why does the source say they still need a Cohesion Act?
Because underneath that surface stability, the clan dynamics are still the primary operating system. The source points out that while Somaliland absolutely has peace, its public sector is heavily influenced by clan patronage.
So even in the quote-unquote success story, if you aren't from the dominant clan in a specific ministry, you probably aren't getting hired.
Exactly. And the danger there is that this creates a ceiling on their long-term development. Well, if you systematically exclude minority clans from the economy or from governance, you are essentially planting seeds for future instability. The source argues Somaliland needs a version of this act specifically to enforce meritocracy,
Right. Yeah.
to have a legal framework that says you get this government job because you're qualified, not because of your grandfather's name.
So it's moving from a clan-based social contract to a citizen-based one, which sounds simple when we say it out loud, but culturally, that is a huge shift.
Huge. It takes generations. Now, compare that to Somalia proper, so Mogadishu and the federal member states. That is a much more fractured situation.
Yeah. The source describes the political system there as the 4.5 system. Can you unpack that for us? Because it sounds like a software version.
It essentially is a software version for power sharing. It's a very specific formula used to share parliamentary seats in government positions among the four major clans.
And the 0.5?
The 0.5 represents a cluster of minority groups who get a half share of representation.
That sounds like a temporary fix that somehow became a permanent lifestyle.
That's exactly how the source describes it. It was originally a triage measure just to stop the shooting during the transition period. But the problem is, it institutionalizes the division.
Right.
You go to parliament as a clan representative, your entire job is to get things for your specific clan. The source argues this creates a trap. You can never build a unified national identity if the political structure forces you to prioritize your clan identity every single day.
So how does a Cohesion Act fix that? Because you can't just outlaw clans. That's their heritage. In a lot of ways, that's their only social safety net.
No, and you absolutely shouldn't try to outlaw it. The goal isn't cultural erasure. The goal is to criminalize the political weaponization of the clan.
Okay. That's a key distinction.
Right. The source suggests Somalia needs laws that specifically punish clan-based incitement and hate speech. You need to create a firm legal boundary where cultural pride ends and political exclusion begins.
It's a delicate line to walk. You're asking people to trust a new legal system over their bloodline, which, in an environment recovering from state collapse, is a huge ask.
It is the hardest ask you can make of a society.
So let's pivot to Ethiopia, because they went a completely different route. They have something called ethnic federalism. They literally drew their internal state borders based on ethnicity.
It did.
And on paper, honestly, that sounds like it respects diversity. It's like saying, you guys govern yourselves over here, we govern ourselves over here, and we all meet in the middle at the federal level.
In theory, yes. It was designed to give different groups autonomy. But the analysis suggests it has severely backfired.
Why?
Because instead of satisfying the desire for autonomy, it has just intensified the competition.
Yeah.
Now you have regions fighting over internal borders, fighting over federal resources, and all of it is organized strictly along ethnic lines. The source argues that Ethiopia has over-indexed on difference and under-indexed on unity.
So if we apply the Kenya blueprint, what's the correction for Ethiopia? Because surely you can't just redraw the map all over again without causing total chaos.
No, you can't. The source suggests they need strong inter-ethnic dialogue mechanisms built into the law. They need a federal structure that forces interaction and cooperation rather than just separation.
Okay.
And again, regulating hate speech is massive here. The rhetoric between regional leaders in Ethiopia has become extremely dangerous at times. They need an independent referee that can penalize leaders who try to score cheap political points by attacking other ethnic groups.
It really seems like the referee is the missing character in all these stories. You need someone to blow the whistle.
Exactly. And nowhere is that more tragically true right now than in Sudan.
Right. Sudan is currently in a state of collapse and active conflict.
Yeah.
So reading this, I kept wondering, is a Cohesion Act even relevant when bullets are flying? It feels a little bit like talking about fire safety while the house is actively burning down.
It might seem premature to talk about legislation right now, but the source makes a compelling argument that it's actually the only long-term way out. The main currency that has been completely destroyed in Sudan is trust.
Yeah.
There is zero trust between the periphery and the center, or between Arab and non-Arab groups.
So you can't just sign a peace deal and cross your fingers.
Right. A peace deal stops the fighting today. A Cohesion Act prevents the fighting tomorrow. For Sudan, the focus of this blueprint would be entirely on accountability. There has to be a robust mechanism where if you incite ethnic violence, you go to jail.
And not just the foot soldiers.
Exactly. Not just the kids on the street, the leaders, the generals. Until people see that the law actually protects them from targeted violence, they will never lay down their arms. Why would they?
They wouldn't. Okay, so we've done the tour of the Horn. We clearly see the need. But I want to get practical for a minute. If I am a legislator in one of these countries and I'm sitting down to draft this law, what are the actual nuts and bolts?
Mechanics.
Right. The source outlines what we could call the 3 pillars of a successful Cohesion Act.
Yes. If you want this to work, if you genuinely want to build this invisible infrastructure, you need these 3 specific components. Pillar 1 is legal deterrence.
Which means teeth.
Real teeth, fines, jail time, actively barring people from holding public office. Hate speech and ethnic incitement can't just be frowned upon by society. They have to be illegal with strict consequences.
Because if the cost of being a divisive politician is low, people will just keep doing it because it works.
Exactly. It rallies the base. It gets you votes. You have to use the law to make the cost of that behavior much higher than the political benefit.
That makes total sense.
Okay.
What is Pillar 2?
Pillar 2 is institutional oversight. This is the data part of the equation. You need a commission that has the legal authority to walk right into a government ministry, demand their hiring records, and publish a report saying, hey, this department is 90% one track.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Precisely. You can't manage what you don't measure. If you don't have hard data on how exclusion is happening, you can't fix it. And importantly, that data has to be public. The citizens need to see it.
Okay, so we have deterrence and we have oversight. And the 3rd pillar?
Formal mechanisms for grievances. And the source argues this is arguably the most important element for maintaining stability.
How does that work in practice?
Well, when a community feels marginalized, maybe they didn't get a development project, or they feel targeted by local police, they need a phone number to call before they call the local militia.
Right.
There has to be a legitimate legal avenue for them to say, we are being discriminated against. And there has to be a body that actually investigates that claim seriously.
I really like the term safety valve for this. It implies a conflict itself is inevitable. People are always going to disagree or feel slighted. But violence isn't inevitable. You just need a safe place for the steam to go.
That's it, perfectly. If I know the court will hear my case fairly, I don't need to pick up a gun. If I know the court is rigged against my clan, the gun is my only logical option.
But, and we have to pivot to the critique here, having the blueprint and actually building the house are 2 very different things.
Oh, absolutely.
We've been praising the idea behind the Kenya model, but the source is actually quite critical of how it's played out in reality. I mean, Kenya isn't some perfect utopia of harmony just because they passed a piece of paper in 2008.
Far from it. The NCIC, the commission in Kenya, has faced significant criticism over the years. The biggest issue they highlight is enforcement. The source explicitly notes that the commission has been accused of being a toothless bulldog.
Barking a lot, but no actual biting.
Or even worse, biting selectively. That's the real danger outlined in the text.
Selective enforcement.
Yes, if the government in power uses the hate speech laws to arrest their political opponents, but conveniently ignores the exact same hate speech coming from their own allies, the law just becomes another weapon.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
It actually makes things worse because it wraps political persecution in the very noble language of justice and national unity.
Exactly. It completely destroys the trust in the institution. So, the crucial lesson for the neighbors, for Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, is that the text of the law matters way less than the independence of the body enforcing it.
If the commission isn't independent of the executive branch, it's doomed to fail.
It will absolutely fail. It has to have the power and the security to investigate the president's friends just as rigorously as the president's enemies.
Which, let's be honest, is an incredibly high bar for a young democracy or a country just coming out of a brutal civil war.
It is a massive challenge. But the source suggests there is another layer that has to support all of this legal framework: education.
Civic education. This really stood out to me in the reading.
Yes, you cannot prosecute your way to national unity. You just can't arrest everyone who holds a prejudice. The law sets the boundary of what is acceptable behavior, but you need a massive generational effort to change the actual software in people's heads.
It's the difference between forced compliance and actual belief. It's like, I can stop speeding because I see a cop in my rear view mirror, or I can stop speeding because I genuinely don't want to hurt anyone on the road.
That's a great analogy. The source argues you need to teach why cohesion matters, and you have to do it in primary schools, in the media, in religious institutions. You have to actively build a narrative of national identity that is somehow more attractive and more beneficial than the old narrative of strict clan loyalty.
And that takes decades.
It takes generations.
It's interesting because we usually think of nation building as something very cinematic that happens right after a war. There are peace treaties and international summits and handshakes for the cameras, but this analysis makes it sound like a constant, very daily maintenance job.
It is. It's grinding work. And
Yeah.
connecting this back to the bigger picture for a second, we so often look at the Horn of Africa through the lens of military strategy or emergency humanitarian aid,
Right, the instinct is always send in the peacekeepers, send in the food shipments.
which are vital, but they are temporary fixes. They address the immediate symptoms, not the underlying disease.
Yeah.
This analysis suggests that the real work of state building is actually much more boring. It's drafting meticulous legislation, it's auditing regional payrolls, it's creating very dry commissions that issue quarterly reports on inclusive hiring practices.
It is boring, but it's foundational. You know, there's this assumption we talked about at the beginning that nations exist simply because of history. We are a nation because our ancestors have always been here on this land. But this deep dive suggests that in the modern, highly diverse world, a nation is actually a choice. It is a formal, legal agreement to coexist.
That's a really powerful distinction to make.
It implies that if you don't have the laws to manage your diversity, you don't actually have a nation yet.
Right.
You just have a collection of tribes sharing a zip code, basically just waiting for the next spark to set everything off.
Waiting for the grid to fail.
Exactly. The infrastructure of unity isn't emotional, it's bureaucratic. And I actually think that's a deeply hopeful message. Because emotions are hard to control, but bureaucracies can be built. You can't force people to love each other, but you can absolutely build a legal system that forces them to treat each other fairly.
It demystifies the whole problem. It takes these things we call ancient hatreds and turns them into management issues. And management issues, no matter how complex, have tangible solutions.
Well, that is certainly a perspective shift. So to you listening right now, the next time you see a headline about conflict in the Horn of Africa, or honestly anywhere in the world with deep divisions, ask yourself, is this an explosion of ancient anger, or is it simply a failure of the legal grid? What happens when a country has the hardware but completely neglects the software? It's something to think about.
A failure of the invisible infrastructure.
Well said. Thank you for walking us through this blueprint today. It's complex, it's heavy, but it's so vital to understand.
My pleasure. It is a heavy topic, but an incredibly important one to dig into.
And thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back with another one soon. Until then, keep questioning the infrastructure around you. Stay curious.